It started as a quiet London morning, grey skies, polished silver, and polite laughter echoing through Buckingham Palace. But by the time the tea had gone cold, one man was walking toward a jet with something he wasn't meant to have. A red folder, royal seal, missing. No alarms, no chase. Just a single guard, trained in silence, stepping into his path. What followed wasn't about politics or power. It was about something far rarer, honor. And in that rain-soaked standoff between a former president and the royal guard, history bent quietly toward the truth. This was the moment the crown refused to bow. Before we open that red folder, make sure you've hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the stories others are too afraid to tell. And tell me, if you were in that guard's place, would you have stepped forward too? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Now let's uncover what really happened when duty met power. The morning light over London was soft and uncertain, filtered through a curtain of pale grey cloud that made the palace seem older than time itself. The Union Jack hung still above Buckingham Palace, unmoving, as though the wind too was holding its breath. Inside the East Wing, breakfast was unfolding with all the precision of a royal performance. The silver gleamed, the porcelain whispered against linen, and the scent of English tea drifted like memory. Nothing appeared out of place. And yet, anyone who has ever lived inside history knows, it never announces when it's about to change. King Charles sat at the head of the long, polished table. His posture straight, his tone gentle but distant. Queen Camilla sat to his right, her hands resting lightly on her napkin, her expression the picture of grace and guarded curiosity. Across from them sat a man who was no stranger to ceremony, former U.S. President Donald Trump. His voice filled the quiet room like a performer testing an audience. He spoke of golf courses and state dinners, of beautiful relationships, and unbelievable deals. He smiled often and laughed at his own stories, his words rising above the clinking of silverware. And yet, for all his practiced ease, there was something about his tone that didn't belong here. It was confident, yes, but threaded with a kind of possession, as if he wasn't just visiting but claiming a small corner of the room with every sentence. Standing near the far wall was a man who'd heard more secrets in silence than most men hear in a lifetime. Sergeant Ewan Hart of the Coldstream Guards, 16 years in service. A soldier's posture, a servant's humility, and the eyes of a man who saw without staring. To most he was invisible, just part of the palace. To the palace, he was the quiet pulse that kept its rhythm steady. Hart stood perfectly still, watching nothing in particular but noticing everything. He caught the way Trump's gaze lingered on the far door, the one leading down the corridor to the King's private study. He saw how Charles's attention dipped just slightly when Trump made a joke about tradition being overrated. And he noticed how Queen Camilla, ever the diplomat, smiled politely but didn't laugh. "Still doing the full thing, huh?" Trump said suddenly, gesturing toward Hart with a folded napkin. "All the marching, the guarding, I've always respected that. Little old-fashioned maybe, but impressive. Really impressive." There was a faint edge beneath the flattery, a tone too sharp to be casual. King Charles looked up, his eyes calm, his words measured. "Discipline," he said softly, "is rarely improved by the absence of tradition." The room went quiet again, not uncomfortably but completely, the kind of silence that has weight. Camilla shifted slightly in her chair, her fork idle. Trump nodded, smiling wider, though the corner of his mouth didn't quite keep up. To the casual observer it was nothing, just small talk among dignitaries. But to Hart, that silence meant something had shifted, something subtle, something that wouldn't show itself until it was too late. Moments later, the breakfast ended as politely as it began. Plates were cleared, tea refilled, and Charles stood with the calm authority of a man born into ceremony. "Please make yourself at home," the king said. His voice was cordial, almost kind. "We'll reconvene this afternoon."
Trump stood as well, smoothing his jacket. "Of course, Your Majesty. Beautiful place. Every time I'm here, I see something new." He smiled, and for a moment, That smile almost looked sincere. Almost. The king and queen departed through the double doors, followed by their attendants. The echo of their footsteps faded into the long corridor. And then, suddenly, the grand breakfast room, all gilded frames and polished chandeliers, was silent again. Only Sergeant Hart and Donald Trump remained. Hart did not move. He stood at his post, eyes fixed ahead. Trump, meanwhile, wandered slowly around the room. His gaze lingered on portraits, chandeliers, the carved molding. He picked up a small silver spoon, examined its engraving, and set it back down with exaggerated care. It was all harmless, but Hart could feel the shift in the air. Something deliberate, something searching. Trump's reflection passed across the glass of a cabinet near the far wall. Inside that cabinet, unseen to most, was a mirrored glimpse of the corridor beyond, and just barely visible through it, the door to the king's private study. Hart noticed where his eyes went, and he knew, without words, what curiosity looked like when it was hiding motive. Trump finally turned toward him, flashing that familiar half-grin. "You must have stood here through 1,000 breakfasts, hey? Same room, same routine." Hart replied quietly, "Routine keeps the peace, sir." Trump's grin flickered. "Yeah," he said, almost under his breath. "Until it doesn't." He picked up his coat from the chair, slipped it on with the ease of someone preparing for an act, and gave a short nod toward Hart. "Fine morning, soldier. Keep up the good work." And then he was gone, out the door, into the corridor. Hart's eyes followed only until the frame of the doorway cut him off. He didn't move. Not yet. But something in the rhythm of the palace felt different now. A breath held, a clock slightly off its beat. He waited for exactly 60 seconds, then turned toward the same corridor Trump had taken. Every step echoed in his chest like a quiet alarm. Outside, the gray morning deepened, and a single crow landed on the palace gate, black wings sharp against the pale sky. It was as if even the city itself was leaning in to listen. No one in that palace knew it yet, but by the end of the day, a red folder would vanish, and the world would be reminded that sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is stand still. The palace corridors stretched long and hushed, a tunnel of portraits, oil and gold, a history of eyes that never stopped watching. Donald Trump walked its length as though it belonged to him. His stride was steady, his gaze wandering, every detail observed with that practiced air of casual entitlement. To anyone else, it was just curiosity. But to Sergeant Ewan Hart, watching from the distant end of the hallway, it was something else, a man pretending not to know exactly where he was going. The air inside Buckingham had a way of swallowing sound. Even footsteps softened, absorbed by carpets that had witnessed wars and weddings alike. Trump passed under the stern gaze of Queen Victoria, her painted eyes fixed on eternity, and stopped in front of a door gilded in brass. The king's private study. He looked left. No one. Looked right. No one. Then, without knocking, he reached for the handle. Inside, the room was a museum of legacy, a place where time itself seemed to obey royal order. The scent of wax polish, old paper, and quiet authority filled the air. Books lined the shelves in tight precision. An antique globe stood by the window, frozen mid-turn. Trump entered with the confidence of someone who'd rehearsed this moment in his head. He crossed to a cabinet by the window, dark oak, small, locked but recently used. From his coat pocket, he pulled out a key. Not a palace key, not issued today. Something older, thinner, with scratches that spoke of another time. It fit perfectly. The lock clicked open. Inside, folded atop a tartan cloth, lay a red leather folder, embossed with the sovereign's golden seal. He hesitated. For all his bravado, even Trump seemed to feel the gravity in the air. This wasn't a simple souvenir. This was weight, the kind that doesn't belong to any one person. Still, he lifted it, carefully, as if the act itself might set something unseen into motion. The door opened behind him. Trump froze. He didn't breathe, didn't tang, just slipped sideways into the shadow behind a heavy curtain. The sound of boots, crisp, measured, entered the room. Sergeant Ewan Hart. He carried a protocol folder under one arm, a security document requiring the king's signature. His steps were deliberate but unhurried, a man moving through duty's daily rhythm. A moment later, King Charles entered behind him, his presence calm, his eyes scanning the report without sitting. "Just this, sir," Hart said, handing him the document. "Perimeter change at midday." Charles nodded, signed the top page, and closed the folder. "Thank you, Sergeant." Hart saluted, crisp and silent, and yet something tugged at the edges of his discipline. He had been in this room earlier that morning, briefly, escorting an aide. There had been another folder on the desk, red, unmistakable. Now, it wasn't there. Hart's eyes lingered half a second longer than usual. He said nothing. The king gave no sign of notice. Duty finished, Hart turned and left. His boots echoed once, twice, then faded down the hall. The study fell silent again. From behind the curtain, Trump exhaled quietly. He stepped out, cheeks flushed, eyes sharp. The folder trembled slightly in his grip. He looked toward the door, then at the desk, the same desk where a moment ago the king had stood. Slowly, he placed the red folder on the polished wood, straightened it, and forced a calm breath. Moments later, Charles reappeared in the doorway, half-turned, speaking with his steward. Trump's tone changed instantly, casual, warm, rehearsed. "This one, sir," he said, gesturing lightly to the folder. "Just an archival matter for the Foundation. We talked about it back in April. Remember?" Charles's glance was brief. Distracted, he saw the seal, the leather, the familiarity of something royal, and nodded absently. "Leave it with me," he said. "I'll have it reviewed." Trump smiled. "Of course." The door closed behind him. For a while, the palace continued in perfect rhythm. Footmen passed through corridors, bells chimed for tea, and the gray sky outside began to thin to silver. But the stillness wasn't real anymore. It was hollow, like a drum before the strike. At 1:12 p.m., Sergeant Hart passed the king's study again during his routine circuit. The room appeared untouched. Desk neat, window half open. The tartan cloth folded perfectly in the cabinet. But the red folder, the one that had weighed on his mind all morning, was gone. He didn't rush. He never rushed. He simply stood there for 3 measured seconds and let the absence confirm what he already knew. Then he turned, walked briskly down the corridor, and descended the service stairwell. Every stride a decision. Inside the security annex, he gave his name, rank, clearance, and 10 words that would quietly set the palace's most discreet alarm in motion. "Escort in motion. Sovereign folder. I believe it's in play." That was all it took. Within seconds, a silent signal moved through channels older than the internet itself. Heathrow's diplomatic wing received an override notice. Every checkpoint logged a name. And somewhere between Westminster and the clouds, a convoy was already being prepped. Meanwhile, 3 floors above, Trump stood in his guest suite, the red folder now laid neatly beside his open suitcase. Sunlight touched the gold seal, and for a moment it almost glowed. He stared at it like a man seeing his own reflection, not in the leather, but in what it represented. Legacy, leverage, maybe something deeper, maybe pride. Outside his window, the courtyard buzzed with quiet activity. 3 black vehicles waited near the carriage entrance, engines off. His flight was logged as diplomatic, private, discreet. Trump zipped the suitcase closed, adjusting his cufflinks with steady hands. To the mirror, he looked calm, presidential, even. But beneath the surface was that same flicker of certainty, the belief that he could leave without being stopped. He didn't notice the faint camera light blinking in the corner of the room, standard security, always on. Nor did he know that one of the palace guards, the same one who never blinked during ceremony, had already begun to move. Down in the courtyard, Sergeant Hart stood near the northwest archway. His eyes tracked motion the way predators track pulse. He saw Trump descending the stairs, too quickly. The travel bag held close to his chest instead of his side. It was a small thing, almost nothing. But to a guard trained to read silence, that was everything. He didn't call out. He didn't shout. He simply turned and began walking. Not toward Trump, but toward the king's study. The air had changed again. This time, it wasn't history waiting to happen. It was duty waking up. The rain had returned. Fine and cold, the kind that soaked through wool and dignity alike. London's sky was a bruise of gray, low and restless. On the edge of Heathrow's diplomatic wing, engines hummed, lights blinked, and somewhere between protocol and conscience, one man was about to draw a line history would remember. Sergeant Ewan Hart stepped out of the black security car before it had even stopped moving. He didn't slam the door. He didn't speak. He just walked, glove hand steady, chin high, eyes fixed ahead. 22 minutes earlier, he'd given the elate. Now, his duty had caught up to him. Ahead, at the far end of the tarmac, a Gulfstream jet waited, its staircase lowered, its engines whispering in anticipation. A convoy of SUVs idled beside it, polished and black, their windows tinted to hide the hurried expressions inside. And there, near the foot of the stairs, stood Donald Trump. The former U.S. president's overcoat flapped faintly in the wind. In his right hand, a leather travel bag, small, worn, and heavy with meaning. Around him, aides spoke in clipped voices airport staff, confirming clearances and manifests. Everything appeared routine. That was the problem. Hart moved through the mist like a ghost in red and black, a single man cutting through a world of status and machinery. The airport police saw the royal insignia on his sleeve and let him pass without question. No radio calls. No hesitation. They knew what that uniform meant. When Trump saw him, the first thing that crossed his face wasn't anger. It was confusion. Then recognition. Then calculation. He straightened his tie and called out, voice half assertive, half curious. "Something I can help you with, soldier." Hart didn't respond. He kept walking until there were 10 feet between them. No more, no less. The engines droned softly behind Trump, like a heartbeat refusing to calm. The aide shifted uneasily. One leaned toward an airport officer. "He shouldn't be here. This is secured clearance." The officer didn't answer. His eyes stayed on Hart. Trump's voice rose again, not hostile, but sharp enough to pierce the drizzle. "Listen, we had a lovely breakfast. Everything's been cleared. You're making this awkward for everyone." Hart stood still. His silence wasn't defiance. It was purpose. Sometimes silence is more than power ever can. Trump's hand tightened around the bag strap. "You're out of your depth," he said, stepping closer. "You don't outrank me. This is diplomatic property. Protected status." Still nothing. Only rain. The tension spread like smoke. Airport lights reflected off the wet tarmac, painting both men in a silver haze, one a figure of authority by title, the other by conviction. Then, for the first time, Hart spoke. His voice was low, steady, measured, the kind of tone that didn't ask, but declared, "There's an item in that bag that bears the sovereign seal. It was not recorded for departure. You will return it." The words hit harder than any shout could have. Trump blinked, caught off guard. "I was given permission," he snapped. "You weren't in the room. You didn't hear it." The king agreed. Hart didn't argue. He didn't need to. He simply looked at him, the calm gaze of a man who'd seen pride crumble before truth too many times. Trump's voice grew sharper. "You're going to stand in my way for what? A folder? A formality?" Hart replied quietly, "For the crown." For a moment, the wind itself seemed to pause. Trump stepped forward, eyes blazing. "I could bury you for this," he hissed. "Your job, your rank, everything. You'd be a footnote on a scandal that never even happened." Hart's gaze didn't waver. "It's not paperwork," he said softly. "It's trust, and you've just confirmed it's in the bag." That was the moment, the pivot where power cracked and truth slipped through. Trump froze. He realized too late what his words had given away. The engines behind them roared louder, impatient, like a beast waiting to depart. The aides began whispering, eyes darting, hands twitching for their phones. But none of them moved to help him. "This is absurd," Trump muttered. "You think you're protecting something sacred? You don't understand what this folder means. It's legacy. It's a gift." Hart's reply came like steel under velvet. "If that were true, sir, it would have been written down." The air grew still again. For the first time, Trump looked uncertain. Rain streaked down his face, blurring the line between sweat and storm. His posture, once proud, softened just slightly. His voice dropped to a near whisper. You'll regret this. When this goes public, when they start asking questions. Hart took one step closer, the space between them closing with quiet finality. Then I'll answer, he said simply. From inside his coat, he withdrew a sealed gray envelope, its wax unbroken, bearing the faint royal insignia. He raised it so that everyone could see. The aides, the airport officers, the ground crew. This is an active intervention, Hart announced calmly. As of this moment, the departure is on hold. You could have heard a pin drop, even against the engines, the rain, the rolling thunder of political consequence. Trump stared at him, then at the envelope, then at the faces now watching, all of them silent witnesses to a truth too obvious to deny. His jaw tightened. His fingers twitched on the leather strap, and then, slowly, deliberately, he reached into the bag. From its side pocket, he pulled out the red folder, untouched, gleaming beneath the rain, the golden seal catching the floodlights like a silent accusation. He held it out, hand trembling but steady enough to save face. Hart stepped forward, accepting it with both hands, not as a trophy, but as a duty fulfilled. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He simply bowed his head slightly, a gesture not of triumph, but of respect. Trump's voice came low, almost hollow. You've made a mistake. Hart looked at him one last time. Perhaps, he said, but not today. He turned and walked away, through the rain, past the stunned aides, past the murmuring crew. His coat darkened, his boots splashing softly against the wet tarmac. The folder rested against his chest, protected, sacred, unyielding. Behind him, the engines quieted. The plane never left. No medal would be pinned that day. No headline would tell his name. But somewhere deep within the walls of the palace, an old truth stirred again, that sometimes the weight of a crown rests not on a king, but on the god who refuses to let it fall. The drive back to Buckingham Palace was wordless. Rain streaked down the windows in thin silver trails, catching the glow of the city lights like slow tears. Outside, London blurred into mist and motion, black taxis sliding past, headlights soft against the fog. Inside the car, Sergeant Ewan Hart sat perfectly upright, the red folder resting across his lap. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. Duty didn't require curiosity, only certainty. The car's engine hummed softly beneath him, the rhythm steady and low. His gloved hand never left the cover of the folder, fingers resting just above the golden royal seal. It wasn't heavy, not in weight, but it carried the gravity of an empire built on quiet men like him. As the vehicle turned past the palace gates, the rain began to fade into drizzle. The guards at the entrance saluted in silence. No fanfare, no announcement, just a silent recognition that something important, something sacred, had made its way home again. The courtyard glistened with puddles as the car slowed to a stop. A faint light shone from the east wing windows. Inside, the palace had already settled into its late afternoon calm, staff moving softly, lamps glowing warm against the stone. Hart stepped out into the cool air. His boots splashed lightly on the cobblestone, the sound of rain still whispering through his uniform. He adjusted his collar, then began the long walk toward the king's study. The red folder stayed pressed against his chest, held not like evidence, but like something fragile. Each corridor echoed differently now. Not empty, not lonely, just aware. He passed portraits of monarchs who'd never know his name, tapestries older than the country itself, and chandeliers that had watched centuries of ceremony unfold beneath them. He was part of that now. Not history by fame, but by faith. At the study door, he paused, knocked once. The door opened, not by a servant, but by the king himself. Charles stood there, still in his tailored day coat, spectacles folded in one hand. His expression, at first, was unreadable. Regal calm, that royal composure passed through generations. But when his eyes fell on the folder, something behind that calm shifted. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper, recognition. Hart stepped inside and walked directly to the desk. He didn't explain. He didn't justify. He simply placed the red folder on the polished wood, perfectly scented. His hand lingered for just a heartbeat, then withdrew. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Charles approached slowly, his gaze steady. He placed a single finger on the folder's seal, as if to confirm that it was real, that the symbol of centuries hadn't vanished under his watch. The air felt sacred. No music, no applause, just duty being quietly fulfilled. Was it intercepted? The king asked softly. Yes, sir, Hart replied. Heathrow Tarmac. Diplomatic wing. Charles drew in a slow breath through his nose. Not relief exactly, but something close to it. The kind of exhale that comes from the knowledge that the line had held. Any trouble? He asked. Hart's reply was simple. Some, but not for long. The king's eyes lifted. For the first time that day, the mask of monarchy softened. Not the crown, not the title, just a man behind both. You've done the crown a service, Charles said quietly. One not many would notice, but one that matters. Hart straightened, shoulders squared, boots together. That's enough, so. Charles gave the faintest smile, one small, human flicker that felt heavier than metals. It is, he said. The silence that followed was the purest kind, not awkward, not tense, but full of something unsaid and deeply understood. Hart saluted. Charles nodded once, slow and deliberate. The kind of nod that says, I see you. When Hart turned to leave, he paused at the door, only for a second, and cast one final glance back toward the desk. The folder sat untouched, bathed in a warm slant of afternoon light. The rain on its leather had dried. The golden seal glimmered faintly, catching a reflection of the window, a symbol not just of power, but of restraint. He left the room as quietly as he'd entered. In the corridor beyond, the world had already begun to move again. Servants adjusting drapes, clerks carrying reports, the echo of distant laughter from the kitchens as the staff prepared for tea. Life went on, unaware that the weight of a nation had been restored by one man's stillness. Hart resumed his post by the eastern hall, the same place he'd stood that morning, before the breakfast, before the rain, before everything had quietly changed. To the passing eye, he looked the same, tall, expressionless, stoic in the ceremonial stance of the royal guard. But if you looked closely, just closely enough, you might notice a faint line of damp still clinging to his collar and a trace of something softer in his gaze. He wasn't thinking of glory. He was thinking of trust, how easily it's lost, how quietly it's kept. Somewhere far above, the Union Jack fluttered again, finally catching a bit of wind. And for the first time all day, the city of London seemed to breathe. Film Epilogue, a quiet legend. The next morning, no papers reported the event. No headlines screamed. No officials named. The world went on as if nothing had happened. But deep within the records of the Royal Guard, one small notation was added, unsigned, unpublicized, and never spoken aloud in interviews. Sovereign item intercepted. Trust restored. Conduct exemplary. No medals, no ceremony. Just those 3 words, trust, restored, exemplary. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, in a quiet flat tucked away in the London fog, Sergeant Ewan Hart hung his uniform to dry. He looked out his window at the dawn light breaking over the Thames and allowed himself the smallest of smiles, the kind that belonged not to victory, but to peace. Some people protect kings. Some protect countries. And a rare few protect the invisible, the fragile thread that keeps honor from unraveling. He was one of them, a silent sentinel in a world that too often forgets what silence means. If this story moved you, if you believe duty still matters in a world that forgets, hit like right now. Leave a comment below. Was Sergeant Hart right to step in? Should he have obeyed protocol or his conscience? And if you want more realistic, cinematic stories about the unseen heroes behind power, subscribe and turn the bell on, because truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just stands still and waits for someone brave enough to notice.